Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma-Informed Church Kid Podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. I wanted to spend the episode for this week taking a look at what I'm calling the how of hurt. In the discussion group, I promised that we would occasionally do these episodes which will take a deeper look at the science behind what hurt is and how it happens. I had every intention of making these thoroughly left-brain episodes full of content and knowledge and evidences of how smart I am, but God had other plans. This past weekend, He wrecked me in all the best ways. I will make that experience the framing device for this The How of Hurt episode, part confessional, part vulnerable share, and hopefully all helpful and edifying to you, the listener. First things first, I love fall. It is objectively the best season. Thanksgiving, which is the sole remaining non-commercialized holiday, cozy weather, kooky Halloween fun, chunky sweaters, warm spice drinks, and best of all, the beautiful and awe-inspiring fall colors when the leaves change. Every year, I go up into the mountains by myself. I pack up my Honda Ridgeline with my truck bed tent and far too many supplies for just a night or two, and spend the weekend driving through Keebler Pass, the Maroon Bells and Snowmass Wilderness, the West Elk Loop, the Million Dollar Highway, the San Juan Mountains, or, in the case of this year, Crested Butte. I usually spend something like 6 to 8 hours of the day driving, pulling over to take horrendously inadequate pictures on my iPhone, and then eventually stopping at some local brew pub to sample the local pumpkin beer before I roll the dice to set up camp at one of the first-come, first-served dispersed camping spots. It's something I've done every year for the last 5 years or so, and sporadically before that as well. I look forward to it every year, and it fills my heart with joy and delight. This year, it also filled my soul with joy and delight. My last episode was an expertise sit-down with Nicholas Soellner, one of my online friends and collaborators. We discussed contemplative prayer, which is somewhat new to me. I've had lots of Protestant experience with prayer, but that experience was very dry and unfulfilling, if I'm honest. I've always hated praying out loud, frankly. The almost enforced spontaneity of Protestant prayer has never sat well with me as a person. I simply have been unable so far to turn off the inner monologue in my brain whilst praying out loud. I'm saying something wrong. I've accidentally done a heresy. What was that person's name again I'm supposed to pray for? Why do I have so many ums and uhs? Oops, I just said just for the 30th time in 2 minutes. Have I sufficiently proven how spiritual and pious I am, or do I need to go longer? But if I go longer, I always hate that when everyone else does it, so why am I doing it? And good Lord, I'm hungry. Can we just eat already? And why do we do this anyway? You get the picture. This is translated even to personal prayer as well. My inner monologue is only slightly less self-conscious when I'm trying to be God-conscious. So I have just tended to avoid prayer, to be blunt. I certainly have never felt it to be particularly powerful or creating any connection with God. It was just something you do. Now, I've made some strides to change with that. I started doing more liturgical prayers, especially those from the Eastern Orthodox tradition in the last 3 years or so. These took out the enforced spontaneity aspect of things, but they didn't really increase much in the way of connection. Honestly, the most spiritual connection I felt has been in the case of using centering prayer, saying short prayers such as the Jesus prayer, along with breathing exercises and other activities to focus my mind and body in a kind of flow state centered on God. That has helped, for sure. But I still feel an absence, like I was praying to the emptiness. This has almost never been a cognitive perception. I've rarely doubted God's existence on a conscious level. I've had too many experiences of God, and honestly, experiences of beauty in the world, to do that. But I've certainly felt His absence, an awful lot, throughout my life. That is why I wanted to begin the practice of contemplative prayer, to add another tool to my spiritual toolbox, to try and feel in my body and soul what I know in my head. And that brings us back to my fall camping trip in the mountains this year. You might have heard me say that I spend about 8 hours each day in the car. That is a lot. In the past 2 years, I've added my mountain bike to the experience as well, which has gotten me out of the car, but not particularly off my keister. A lot of sitting, a lot of silence, and a lot of time. I mentioned that I've been pairing centering prayers with other activities. One of those has been mountain biking. I find that I prefer to have prayers in my head while my body is cranking up the side of a mountain. It really is the experience where I feel the most connected to God, albeit still less than I would like, or other people talk like I should be experiencing. So this year, I decided to try contemplative prayer, in conjunction with having just recorded an episode about it. So, while driving, I took in the beauty of the aspens and attempted to receive that as just a gift from God. And let me tell you, this year the aspens were stunning. Just jaw-droppingly gorgeous. More than I've ever seen them in previous years. I even overheard some natives grudgingly admitting that even they have never seen them this beautiful before. I will add some pictures in our Facebook discussion group to prove my point, but the thing is that this was the absolute perfect year to try and receive the beauty of God's creation through mostly wordless contemplative meditation on His character, goodness, and love. And that's where my encounter with God began. I have only felt as if I have heard a recognizable voice about 3 times in my life. But this time, I did. I heard God, or perhaps a better way to say that is, I felt God say, "This is for you." And immediately, without analytical logic or evaluative criticism, I grasped the sense that this was not meant as, "I arranged the chemistry and meteorology of the planet over months and years just to make you happy today." I received that statement in a very clear sense. God delights in my delight. He loves seeing me pleased. He rejoices when I rejoice. My smile makes Him smile. My laughter makes Him laugh. I got the clearest sense I have ever gotten that God was present with me in the car and later on the bike, and I could feel His delight. That was an overwhelming sense of euphoric joy and anticipation. And then I was immediately floored with a realization that this was the first time I had ever felt that, which is saying something in 42 years of being a church kid. I had gone some 35 plus years in a relationship that is supposed to be the most intimate I have ever had and ever will have, and only now have I had the felt sense that God really, actually, truly liked me. Not just that He was duty-bound to save me because of His love, or to fix me because of His justice, or to whatever else, but that He genuinely and spontaneously smiled simply by my presence. No purification needed, no confession needed, no scrupulosity about anything needed, but just simply me. That caused the second wave of emotion, racking sobs. I wept in a way I haven't wept since I heard my daughter's first cry. I vividly remember that moment. I was in the hospital room with my warrior of a wife. There were some mild to moderate complications with the delivery. It was taking much longer than expected. I was focusing totally on her and helping her to focus and feel my presence. I was stroking her hair and 100% locked into what was happening with her, and then a single cry came out of my daughter's brand new lungs. I can still recall every pitch and scrape of that sound, because it wrenched sideways something both deeply visceral and spiritual within my being. One moment, I wasn't a father. With that single sound, I was. I have never had a moment like that where my whole existence broke in a good way. Until I was driving up to Crested Butte, communing with God while soaking in the aspens. He presented me with a beautiful and precious gift, said, "I did this for you," and beamed from ear to ear as he saw my eyes go wide and my breath catch in my throat. God likes me. He saw me, and I saw him. To quote a song from the Disney movie Tangled, all at once, everything is different now that I see or hear you. Why did I cry at that? Partly just the reckless extravagance and blatant injustice of it all. I remember saying over and over, "You don't want me. You don't want me." I remember hearing or feeling back, "Of course I do. I made you." I remember being washed over with so many of the times where I've yelled at my daughter in anger, or harbored resentment toward my wife, or cut corners in my job, or wasted my time and talents on meaningless and pointless pursuits, etc. All the ways I had failed to image God well. I got a clear sense of just a smile and a hug. That hug communicated to me, "I know that. You think I can't handle that? Come here." Then it was the fear. But what about tomorrow? I have this lifelong tendency to vacillate between emotional highs and numbing lows in my spiritual walk. I know myself too well to promise anything to God. He knows me too well to accept my promises as anything other than the momentary protestations of a fickle heart. But I've always had this sense that he accepted them in a kind of, "Yeah, okay, you did the right thing today. We'll see. I'll be here the same time tomorrow, I guess." That day, I got a different sense. I got the clear impression that God genuinely delighted in me bringing all my yuck to him. He responded with something like, "Fantastic. Let's get to work. I can't wait to see what we can make of this together." Cue wave number 3, more tears. This experience continued in waves all throughout the weekend, while biking, while driving, while settling down at camp, etc. I have been a church kid my whole life, and I have never had such a soul-settling experience of God's delight and pleasure. All of this is directly related to the how of hurt. There is a branch of psychology with which I am intimately familiar, the science of attachment. I did my master's thesis on attachment. My preferred strategy of healing for both individuals and couples is focusing on building earned, secure attachment, and I have read multiple books on attachment science since gaining licensure. Simply put, what trauma does is it disorders our attachment in immensely powerful and immensely destructive ways. Let me detour very briefly to explain. The science of attachment came out of the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the 1960s and 70s. Together, they discovered that our experiences with early caregivers caused patterns of psychological connectedness which were remarkably stable during both childhood and adolescence. Later research has found that these patterns continue to predict with high probability the psychological quality of our adult emotional and relational worlds. Our ability to be both close and far away, our ability to regulate emotion, and in general, our ability to be empathetic, trusting, and compassionate. These patterns of connectedness were called attachment patterns, and they fell into 4 major categories: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, which is a mix of anxious and avoidant, and secure. There will be an infographic containing a primer on these patterns in the show notes. Any of these attachment patterns are possible in response to trauma. Fundamentally, what happens is that our brain-body system absorbs the environment it finds itself in, discovers that this environment is deeply disturbing and unsafe, and then sears the neural memory of that event into our limbic region and brainstem, the downstairs portion of our brains, which is connected to our body far more than our mind or cognition. Having branded our bodies with the somatic and emotional memory of that trauma, our brains then create survival mechanisms, patterns of response which will act in extreme ways at a hair trigger to activate the whole neural network that is needed to respond to that unsafe and disturbing environment. And because this is a survival mechanism, it happens before we are aware of it, based on stimuli which is only loosely associated with the event or environment, and it only has two settings, 0 and 11. It is better to cause pain and distress to the organism, i.e., a panic attack, a numbed out shutdown, a dissociative event, etc., to avoid allowing that thing to happen again. And that thing can be absolutely anything. A person who left us when we needed them most. A love who rejected our advance in a hurtful and embarrassing way. A loss that we have no explanation for the why. A death that left us feeling broken and empty. Something precious and intimate that was stolen from us. Or even a God who is so disgusted with us that he can only look at his son to avoid looking at us. That is where my mountain experience comes back into the story. This is what I always remember being told. Not in those words, of course. Remember, the effects we've been talking about are not encoded on the higher order brain regions, nor are they sequenced as cognitive narrative. They are stored as impressions, feelings, sensations, intuitions, memory fragments that don't seem to fit. I remember from very early on a sense that God didn't like me. How could he? I was a sinner, and he was holy, and a holy God can't be in the presence of sin. Can't even look at it, I was told. And here's the thing. That sin that I had in me wasn't just a dirty garment I was wearing that I had to take off. It was coded into my DNA. It was me. There was no, and never could be, any sense of hate the sin and love the sinner, because in the eyes of this God, that was a specious distinction. When God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin, he only sees his son, was the line I remember. I made up a term for it, sun glasses. This was supposed to make me feel better. You're a worm, you're nothing but filthy rags. There is nothing worthwhile or beautiful or lovely or even just good in you. But hey, it's all okay. You've got Jesus, who stands in your place, takes the death blow that should have fallen on you so that the God who hates you is now allowed to love you. And then the altar call of this good news came. Receive that love. Remember the N.T. Wright quote I cited a few episodes back? That didn't look like or feel like love. And it absolutely, without a doubt, never felt like delight. So, to sum up, I developed an anxious attachment style in relation to my Heavenly Father. I became preoccupied with doing enough to keep the wrath at bay. And also, I was told that Jesus did it all, so I didn't have to do anything. But also, I was told that I was supposed to do good works. These didn't earn my salvation, of course not, but they were the fruit of it, and if I was a dry tree bearing bad fruit, then I was only good for being cut up and tossed into the fire. But don't worry, God is love and mercy, but also justice. So, persevere, run the race with endurance, keep the faith, have full assurance in the finished work of Christ. But what will give you assurance of your assurance? Because every time you think you are doing good, you really are doing it out of subtle evil motives that you aren't aware of, but God knows, sees, and despises. And that is who you are, deep down. Oh, and he also loves you. Is it any wonder? With all this confusion and consternation, I developed an inability to feel God's pleasure. The only time I ever felt like I could was when I did something good. But right then, here comes pride, and now it's all hopeless again. But on my drive up to Crested Butte, I felt something shift sideways in my soul. I got a clear sense that my Father was hard to satisfy, yes, but equally easy to please. C.S. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, talks about God being pleased with our stumbles. That line always stuck in my head, but it never sunk in. I thought, sure, he's more happy that I'm doing that than sinning, but it's still not good enough. Nothing ever is or could be. Even the finished work of Christ was of no help, because then God wasn't seeing me. He was seeing Christ because he couldn't look at me. So how could he possibly delight in and be pleased with me? Henri Nouwen, a Dutch Catholic priest, has said this quote, "The real work of prayer is to become silent and listen to the voice that says good things about me. To gently push aside in silence the many voices that question my goodness, and to trust that I will hear the voice of blessing. That demands real effort." End quote. It certainly does. When the intellectual and spiritual and heart-level current one swims upstream against is the one I have been describing. This past weekend, I had a moment to become silent and listen to the voice that says good things about me. Because I took advantage of that moment, I was able to gently push aside all the other voices that questioned my goodness and trusted in the voice I heard, the voice of blessing. But I am still a left-brain creature. So what about sin? What does all this right-brain warm fuzzies about God mean for a theology of sin? This is why the groundwork we have been discussing in the podcast so far has been vital to my process of attachment repair. Because all that groundwork has been pointed to one conclusion: the image of God is never lost. That spiritual connection with God, that natural inclination to love God, that glorious inheritance to share in the divine nature, has never been and cannot be lost. This is even true in a sinful world, and for a sinful human being. Basil the Great, a 4th century church father, has said it this way: "Love of God cannot be taught, for we have neither learnt from another person to rejoice in the light and to cling to life, nor did anyone else teach us to love our parents or those who brought us up. In the same way, or much more so, the learning of the divine longing does not come from outside. In the very nature of every human being has been sown the seed of the ability to love." My error was in believing that that seed had been swallowed up by the serpent. This mattered immensely to how I viewed myself. When I messed up, I saw that as evidence of my deepest and most innate sinfulness, which I saw as the core of who I am. I looked at myself, saw nothing good, and believed that the only good which could possibly be in me had to be a supernatural gift of grace. I had forgotten that there was another reaction which I had: remorse. The very fact that I recoiled of the wrong I did was itself evidence that the seed was not gone. I was right in one sense. The good within me was a supernatural gift of grace. I was wrong in another sense. The good within me was part of my nature. The effects of the Genesis 3 fall weren't to destroy that seed. The effects of the Genesis 3 fall were to disorder the soil in which that seed grew. Rather than berate myself for being a worthless worm, I needed to cultivate that seed. In St. Basil's words, to nourish it with knowledge and to bring it to perfection, to stir up the spark of divine longing hidden within you. But let's not get too abstract. Let's get down to brass tacks. I had a reinforcement of the beauty and power of this approach this past week. My daughter was staying home sick from school one day, and she was feeling well enough to go on a walk. We took a short loop around our neighborhood and eventually passed the crosswalk we take every day to school. This crosswalk has a button you can push to make oncoming traffic stop so you can cross, but it is otherwise a wide open road. My daughter, being the absent-minded little butterfly that she is, pushed the crosswalk button even though we were quite clearly not going to cross the street. I felt a strong surge of annoyance and embarrassment and anger well up in me, as several cars were unnecessarily stopped in both directions. My more likely than not response, I say with just and proper guilt, has been to criticize her loudly and strongly for her thoughtlessness. But after having just had the attachment repair experience I had, I found myself better able to handle my passions in that moment. I called her over calmly and asked her why she had pushed the button. She slowly and tentatively began to describe that she just wanted to see what it would be like, with no small amount of trepidation, probably because of my more than likely response. This quickly devolved into tears and her saying, "I feel bad because I made all those people wait." I was able to give her a hug, make gentle eye contact with her, stroke her back, and tell her that I love her and she is still good no matter what. I affirmed my delight in her caring and kind heart, and we problem-solved together how to think before she acted next time. I share that story not to brag on myself, but to tell on myself. That has not been normal for me. But I saw a powerful example in action through my own body of all places of the energies of God at work in the world. I have said for quite some time now that there is an inviolable principle of spirituality. We become like what we worship. I had been worshiping a God who was implacably focused on doing the right thing, one who needed to punish in order to be just, who never delighted in his children, and who could only stand to look at them when he pretended that they were somebody else. With guilt and remorse, I confess that I had more elements of that pattern of attachment in my relationship with my daughter than I want to admit. A brief encounter with the true beauty of holiness and love and delight opened a corner of my heart and allowed that beauty, holiness, and love to spill out into the world. And I pray that through the mercy of a gracious God, it will plant in the soil of my daughter's heart and bear good fruit to choke out all the bad fruit I have already planted there. Seeing God's delight in myself allowed me to delight again in my daughter, even when she messed up. And so, when I talk about hearing the voice of blessing that says good things about me, that is what I am talking about. When I talk about the good news of the gospel, that is what I am talking about. When I talk about rediscovering a God who delights in my delight, who not just loves me, but likes me, who welcomes me with open arms instead of having to overcome his pesky punishment problem before he can welcome me home, that is what I am talking about. For quite some time now, at least since COVID hit, I have been exploring the perspective of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the earliest Christians. This has heavily influenced the reconstruction of religion we have been doing so far on Genesis 1 through 3. That road of inquiry turned a major corner this past weekend on the drive up into the mountains. Not just a left-brain acknowledgement and awareness of propositional truth. God has been working on me for that for the last 5 years. But a right brain deeply felt and intimately experienced encounter with his face. I have had glimpses of this before. One in particular I remember quite strongly was a note I received from one of my former coworkers and fellow churchgoers, indicating that they believed they had heard from God that, quote, "I really like Spencer. I like hanging out with him. The people that are on Spencer's heart are on my heart." That was incomprehensible to me, and so it shocked me more than it shook me. I kept that note because it seemed relevant and important at the time, but I didn't have the framework to accept it, so I just let it sit in my home office. This past weekend, along with that note and all the theological reframing I've been doing the past 5 years, I finally felt securely attached to the heart of my Father, the one who loves spending time with me just because. The one who will literally descend into hell to rescue me. The one who delights in my delight. The one who not just loves me, but likes me. And that is my story on the How of Hurt for this week. It has been much more personal and individual this time, But I believe that this is what I needed to put out there. I pray that it is what someone out there needed to hear. One last word before I go. This is only my story of my encounter. Many of you may hear this and think, I want that too. Why don't I have that? Why doesn't God give me that? I've been praying for that and crying out to God for that diligently for years. Where is it? Where is He? Etc. I want to end today by affirming your experience as valid and to refuse to give an easy answer. There is no easy answer. There is no neat left brain explanation I can give that will make all the fragmented pieces of your story or your soul fall easily into place. I don't know why it hasn't happened to you, and I hear and acknowledge and cry along with your pain. I want that for you too, deeply and with every fiber of my being. That is frankly why I do this podcast, to be a bit of light in the darkness, not to give answers that make it all better. I can't tell you what to say, or how to do it, or why God remains hidden. The only thing I want to say is that He is able to be found. I have found Him, and it has changed my life. And I continue to find Him, over and over, every day that I continue to seek Him. I don't encounter Him every day. It took me 35 years to do this, but I keep looking and listening and making myself ready. And I hope and pray that you will do the same. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give it a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet, sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media at ChurchKidPod, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve wherever I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.